So what happens if most trade is really dependent on the currency of a specific member of the IMF? Well, that's what happened in the 1960s, as I said. So most of the reserves were either gold or US dollar reserves held by national central banks. The growth of trade implied that you needed to have a proportional growth of international reserves, but you cannot really enlarge the production of gold. Gold is mined, and there are limits to how much gold you can extract every year. So this was not something that could be used as a way to sustain the growth of the money in circulation in international reserves. As I said, this was also dependent on particularly following once the British pound sort of abandoned convertibility, that they had to keep these trade deficits. Then this trade deficit by the US became sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy that the more you incur deficits, the more dollars are out there outstanding, and conversion becomes a fiction. It's obvious that there are far too many dollars held by foreign central banks than there is gold to meet the promise to convert 1 ounce of gold troy to $35. So it became unsustainable. Now, what were the alternatives? Well, there was an alternative thought out by Keynes in the initial discussion at the Bretton Woods Conference, and that was to create sort of a new international currency called the bancor. It was not a currency that we could hold in our hands. It was sort of a currency denominator for central banks. And this idea was partially resumed with the first amendment of the IMF, decided in 1969. And what happened was the creation of something called special drawing rights, or SDRs for short. Now, these would be created by a decision of the Board of Governors with an 85% qualified majority requirement on the basis of a proposal by the managing director in accordance with the agreement of the executive directors. And so this would create SDRs. Okay, so the question then is, okay, what is this really? Well, as you can see, these are now, early on, there was 9.3 billion USDRs. Right now, there are currently about 200 billion, so it has increased significantly. This increase, so this is approximately 291 billion US dollars. Now, although this is a substantial number, it's still a small part of current international reserves, and most of these allocations of SDRs, so the majority of SDRs was actually created following the 2008 financial crisis, because at a certain point, when the IMF had to intervene and support a number of members, Portugal, Ireland, etc., the IMF was starting to run out of money. So one of the things that was done following the crisis, and there was a lack of liquidity. So one of the things that was done in 2008 was precisely to have the IMF issue new SDRs. So, as I said, so as you can see, most of the allocation, as you can see, is mostly taken following the financial crisis. So, of 200 and something billion, 161.2 billion was issued following the financial crisis. So, the overwhelming majority of SDRs were issued following this crisis. Okay, so a few questions about SDRs. Now, developing countries, SDRs are then maybe used in international financial payments. And there was a question when SDRs were created. Well, if we're going to create a new form of international reserve, shouldn't developing countries that need to finance their imports, because these imports are crucial to their economic development, shouldn't developing countries be allocated more SDRs than developed countries? Well, this is an ongoing debate, but the problem is that the rules are that SDRs are to be allocated proportionally to a member's quotas. So, as we've seen, the US, most developed economies, they make up the majority of quotas, so they will receive the majority of allocations of SDRs. And that's sort of the argument, the issue of linkage, that they should be linked to development. SDRs follow the same rule as the rule on allocation of quotas and voting rights. There's the legal basis for these emissions are Articles 15 and 18. So in order to avoid economic stagnation and deflation, and as well as excess demand and inflation in the world, but they're still a complement, so a supplement to existing reserves. They're not to become sort of the major international reserve. And they're managed by a specific department within the fund. And so if you look at the workings of the fund, there's a specific department in the IMF staff that deals with these SDRs. Okay, so what is my image is frozen? Okay, oh, it's going on still. So SDRs are really not a currency, and this means that the IMF does not back its value. So this is not like the euro. If the euro was to suddenly cease to exist, the European Central Bank would be responsible for the conversion of euros into some other form of payment. So you could sue if you're a foreign central bank and you have euros, you can sue the European Central Bank in order to obtain the value of the euros you're still holding. So ultimately, it's the European Central Bank that is behind the euro, and well, ultimately, actually, the member states of the eurozone are behind the euro. Now, the IMF does not back its value, so there's a separation of assets and property, which means that it's not a claim on the fund's overall resources. It's a claim to the fund's resources in freely usable currencies. What does this mean? If I have, say, 1 million SDRs, I can ask the fund to sell me US dollars or euros to the value of 1 million SDRs. And then I can use those dollars or euros in order to make international payments. But that's it. There's no right to having this recognized as a currency. So this allows me to buy other currencies in exchange for my SDRs. Now, because this is not a currency, the IMF is not required to accept your SDRs with nothing in return. So what happens is that, as we're going to see, members have these obligations to maintain a certain balance of their SDRs with regard to their quota. So they cannot overreach their quota by simply, handing over to the IMF SDRs and getting US dollars or Japanese yens or British pounds or euros in return. Okay, how can these SDRs be used? Well, the rules are set out in Article 19 of the Articles of Amendment. A member may agree bilaterally to exchange SDRs for its currency with another member, and currently there are 32 such arrangements. So, the US Federal Reserve may say, okay, well, I'm willing to accept, they have an agreement with, say, Argentina, I'm willing to accept SDRs and to give you dollars in exchange for those SDRs up to a certain amount. Okay, that's a bilateral agreement. So if Argentina has a need for US dollars in order to pay for its imports, it can use this arrangement in order to increase their dollar reserves by handing out SDRs. Now, when you have members that have a strong reserve position, they may be required to purchase SDRs from members with a weak external position. So imagine in this case, Argentina has a weak external position. It is under a lot of pressure because the investors think that they do not have reserves to sustain their balance of payments, and because of that, the value of the peso, of the Argentinian peso, is going down versus the dollar. What would happen here is, members with strong reserves would then buy Argentina's SDRs in exchange for US dollars. Now, as a result of this purchase, the demand the reserves in dollars held by Argentina go up, and this helps it to prop up the value of the peso, because now it can sell those dollars in exchange for pesos. And if there's an increase in demand for pesos, then the peso exchange rate will go up against the dollar. So that's the idea. And so that's how SDRs are to be used. So they're mostly a way for members holding SDRs to obtain some freely usable currency in exchange for that. Okay, so you can have SDRs and never use them, and that's not the idea. The idea is to use SDRs as a way to complement to supplement international reserves. So the IMF rules set out a number of incentives to use SDRs in Article 20. So if you have your allocation, okay, and the allocation pays charges. So if you hold on to the SDRs that amount to your quota, then you have to pay a charge to the IMF. But if you hold more SDRs than your quota, then the excess SDRs will earn you an interest. And obviously, the charges are equal to the interest. So this gives you an incentive to hold SDRs, and so to sell your currency in exchange for SDRs, because then you'll be rewarded with interest rates. And these interest rates are paid by members that are still holding their SDRs up to the value of their allocation. Okay, so other than states, only so-called prescribed holders may use SDRs. Examples are the Bank for International Settlements, the European Central Bank, together with the regional development banks. The European Development Bank, or BIRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the Asian Bank for Reconstruction and Development, etc. And they may use SDRs, but then they have to acquire them from members only. So states, and that is to say, central government. Okay, so what is the value of an SDR? Well, initially, the value is determined by the fund. As you can see, very qualified majorities, highly qualified majorities. Originally, it was defined in terms of gold, but with the Second Amendment, since gold was replaced from, was kicked out from the international monetary system as a reserve, this was no longer viable. And so it was redenominated in terms of a fixed basket of currencies. The US dollar, the UK pound sterling, Japanese yen, German marks, and the French mark, and the French franc, sorry. Right now, its composition is the US dollar. 41.73% of its value is the US dollar. The euro, almost 31%. The Chinese renminbi, 10.92%. Japanese yen, and UK pound sterling. So what does this mean? Well, every day you check the current exchange rate for each of these currencies, and the value of each of these currencies is then sort of inputted to the SDR in this percentage. Okay, so if the US dollar goes up, but say the Chinese renminbi and the euro go down, ultimately the value of the SDR is stable. So even when these currencies that form the basket of currencies that is the SDR, even although they are fluctuating, the SDR tends to be much more stable than each individual currency, because since it is a basket of currencies, some will go up, but others will go down. And so, this will tend to balance the overall value of the SDR. So the SDR provides also with a very stable unit of value. And if you go to any exchange market, so if you Google what's the value of SDR today, you will get the estimated value in terms of dollars on the basis of this mix of currencies. Now, as we're going, so the SDR is sort of a key component of the IMF system. Its aim was to increase liquidity. It has been substantially reinforced following the financial crisis, but it's still not an alternative to the US dollar, to be quite clear. It does also have this other problem that has so far not been solved, that developed countries tend to receive or will receive more SDRs with each allocation, simply because allocations are fixed to the value of quotas. And so far, there seems to be no alternative to this arrangement.